Good morning. Thank you all for joining us for this virtual teach-in today. My name is Rebecca Tepper, and I have the privilege of leading Attorney General Healey's energy team. If this is the first time you're meeting our team, you're in for a treat. When people ask me about my job, I always talk about how committed the team is and how committed they are to the public interest and how hard they work on behalf of electric and gas customers. But in the end, it always comes down to, I love my job because I work with the nicest group of people. And you're going to get to meet 4 of them today because they're going to be the teachers. So before we get started, I wanted to give you a little bit of background on the genesis of the event. Over about a year ago, our office hosted a day-long symposium about how the electricity markets need to adapt to the clean energy future. We had top leaders with varying points of view, experience, and expertise come together to discuss how markets can support a no-low carbon future and how to transition to that future. In March, we issued a white paper summarizing the day and identifying potential next steps to help advance market modernization. So we came up with a couple of recommendations. One of them was we recommended that the New England states work together and provide guidance to the region about who should define and deliver the kinds of energy that we need to ensure reliability and to meet our clean energy future. And as you will hear from Christina later, the states are on this path. So that's a really good sign. We also recommended that on a parallel track, NEPL and ISO New England consider possible wholesale market frameworks that best support a clean energy future. And that now is also happening, so that's very positive. The white paper also emphasized that resolving these complicated issues will require the input and support of traditional stakeholders and the broader public, including grassroots advocates, academics, elected officials, and our next generation of young people. So as the Massachusetts ratepayer advocate charged with representing customers on these matters, our office launched an educational campaign to enhance knowledge about the New England electric grid and its relationship to the state's climate policies. Some of you may have seen the 2 videos that we put out, where we tried to explain the issues to people who sort of aren't as steeped in this stuff every day as we are. So this teach-in is another part of that educational campaign. Let me tell you about a little bit about what's going to happen here in the next couple of hours. So today's program is going to be split into 3 segments. First, hopefully we're going to hear from the Attorney General. She may be a little late. We'll have to see. Second will be the educational component. And third, we're going to have a Q&A session. So the educational component is going to include 4 general topics, and each of them will be presented by a different member of the Attorney General's energy team. So first, we're going to hear about an introduction to the energy system, and then the evolution of the New England power system. And then we're going to take a 10-minute break. I don't know about you, but I can't sit for 2.5 hours without a break. So we'll have a break, and then we'll return to an introduction to the wholesale markets and an introduction into ISO New England stakeholder process. Finally, we'll have a Q&A session. So just a couple more notes. In designing the program for today, we really tried to strike a balance so that the program can be useful to lots of different people who are in different places on the learning curve. So you may find today that sometimes it's a little too basic for you, or other times maybe it's too much in the weed, but I hope you'll stick with us. And I encourage you to adopt my philosophy for all conferences like this, which is, if I learn one new thing or get one new idea, it's a success. So I hope in the 2.5 hours that we have, you will learn more than one new thing and have more than one new idea. But I hope that everybody learns a lot today and they get what they are looking for. One quick point about the Q&A session. We asked people to submit questions in advance of the program, and we received over 100 questions. So we're not going to have 2 days to answer all those questions. So what we did was we selected 6 questions. We kind of mushed some issues together and came up with something that we thought was the most representative of the themes of the questions that we received. So I'm going to read each question, and our panelists then will have an opportunity to respond. So anybody, nobody's seen the Attorney General, am I right? Okay, so I was going to introduce Attorney General, but I think first what we will do is we'll go ahead and get started with the first program, and when she gets here, she can talk to you some more. So I'm going to introduce Megan Herzog, who's going to do our very first educational component. So thank you, Megan. Hi.
Hi, Rebecca. Thanks for that introduction. Oh, I'll take a pause for AG Healey.
Well, I don't need to say much else, but I think Attorney General Healey doesn't need an introduction, but I hope you'll welcome Attorney General Healey, your Attorney General, and our terrific boss, Maura Healey.
Hey, Rebecca. How are you?
How are you? I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. This is really nice that we're doing this teach-in.
We're excited about it.
Rest assured, I'm not doing any of the teaching. I'm just doing the welcoming.
Perfect.
You know, it's great to see so many people, right, who are participating today on a really superly important topic. I want to thank you, Rebecca and Melissa Hoffer, for your just tremendous leadership of our energy and environmental team, and you know, just the fantastic work that you all have been doing. And in particular on this one, I know that Ben Griffiths, Marlon Dos Santos, Taylor O'Hare, Megan Herzog, Tim Rapucci, Christina Ballou, and Aaron Kravitz worked hard to make this, to pull off this and plan for this actual teach-in. So thanks very much, guys. So let's just talk about what got us here today and what you can do to help. There's no question that we're in the midst of a climate crisis that's worsening every day. Climate change is here, and its disparate impact in our Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities is especially troubling. Now, across this country, the good news is millions of people are demanding change, and people like you are playing a critical role in shaping our clean energy future and protecting our planet and our public health. And I just really appreciate, you know, that the grassroots efforts, right? The grassroots efforts here in Massachusetts have really resulted in meaningful changes at both the state and local level, which is not a surprise. I mean, Massachusetts has had a long history of climate activism. Time and time again, we've led the nation in protecting the environment and addressing climate issues. And, you know, I say that with huge kudos to my team who recently released that report of the more than 200 actions taken against the Trump administration to protect our climate, to protect our clean energy future. And it's just an example of just how nation leading this team has been, working alongside so many of you together in those efforts. Today, you know, Massachusetts has some of the most aggressive climate laws in the country. We lead the nation in energy efficiency, and we're going to be hosting the first North American large offshore wind farm. We've got a $13 billion clean energy industry. And our cities and towns are stepping up as well, responding to the call for clean energy by committing to their own aggressive climate goals and embracing community choice and installing electric vehicle charging stations and building out, you know, solar generation. And none of this would have happened without people on the ground demanding that change, supporting that change. So I really want to shout out the grassroots advocacy. And now, you know, knowing that, you know, encourage what we're focusing on today, encourage that grassroots advocacy on ISO New England and the wholesale of electricity markets. You know, that's why, as the state's ratepayer advocate, my office a while back launched an education campaign, complete with a cartoon, to help spread the word about the crucial role that our wholesale power markets play in helping transition away from dirty fossil fuels towards a clean energy system. And more so than ever, ISO New England and FERC are setting rules that greatly impact our clean energy future and our ability to implement the state and local policy that's necessary to reach our goals. So from making decisions about whether renewables can participate in our wholesale electricity markets to how those markets impact state clean energy policies. FERC's and ISO New England's decisions matter. We need our wholesale electricity markets to support the wide-scale deployment of low, no-carbon resources, as well as the decarbonization of our heating and transportation sectors. Yet today, our wholesale markets aren't producing the clean generation that we need to meet our state's clean energy mandates. So given the importance of these issues, a top priority for our office is to represent the customer's interests at ISO, New England, and FERC. We're a voting member of the New England Power Pool, and our own Christina Ballou. Tina's done a great job. You're going to hear from her later today. She sits on the executive committee of that body. We also chair the coordinating committee of the ISO New England Consumer Liaison Group. And in these roles, we've been fighting for a level playing field in the markets for renewables, demand response, and storage. We want to focus on customer bill impacts. We want more information sharing between ISO New England and consumers. We want competition between companies to build transmission. And we want meaningful consideration of environmental impacts in decision making. We've also testified before Congress and helped lead nationwide efforts to improve ISO governance issues such as transparency, inclusivity, and equity. So, like so many of the climate challenges we face, I believe an informed and active public matters. We're not going to meet our aggressive and necessary climate goals without the engagement and the trust and the buy-in and the support of the public. And I hope that what you learn here today will provide you with what you need to make your voices heard. Again, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today and for your commitment to protecting our planet and our health. And now I'll turn it back over to Rebecca. I know I've looked at the agenda. It's going to be a great day. So enjoy it. And I look forward to all the great work that's going to come out of it.
Thank you so much. That was really great. Really appreciate you taking the time to see all of us. And we're really excited about today. So thanks for letting us do it.
All right. Thanks for the idea. You guys, it's all you. You came up with it. You know what to do. So I'm just happy to sing your praises and welcome everybody to this important conversation. All right.
Thank you.
Enjoy today.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
So our first speaker, as I mentioned before, is going to be Megan Herzog, and she's going to talk to you about the New England power system. So Megan, nice to see you. Take it away.
Yes, thank you again, Rebecca, and good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Megan Herzog. I'm an attorney in A.G. Healey's Energy and Environment Bureau, and it's my pleasure today to give a brief introduction to the power system. So essentially just going to give a really quick overview of why the system is designed the way it is, who is in charge of making sure that it works properly so that the lights turn on when we flip our switch and our showers are hot when we want to take a shower, and just a little brief history of how we got here to the system that we have today. So first, just a couple fundamental features of electricity that are important to understand how the grid was designed the way it is. So first, electricity can't be directed in any particular direction like you would send a letter or an email to someone. It flows along the path of least resistance, like water through streams and in pools. And also, it's hard and expensive to store large quantities of electricity. So it's the ultimate real-time product. In our power system, supply and demand are constantly balanced on a minute-to-minute and second-to-second basis, so that the drains in the pool and the faucets in the pool of electricity that we all share are constantly balanced to ensure that the system remains reliable for us. So although the system is quite complex, it's generally thought of as broken down into two main parts. We have the wholesale high voltage power side and the local, or often called retail side. So first, let's just take a look at the wholesale side. Historically, it was cheaper to generate electricity in large centralized, or often referred to as utility scale plants. So this might look like a power plant that uses fossil fuels, converting coal or gas or oil into electricity, or for instance, a hydroelectric dam that uses the flow of water, or more recently, large scale wind or solar farms. Those plants generate electricity and inject it into the power grid. It hits the high voltage transmission system, which you might think of as like the interstate highway system, but for electricity. So thousands of miles of high voltage wires that crisscross the country, connecting all of the power plant generators with the folks who consume electricity. So, here in New England, we have thousands of miles of transmission with electricity moving very fast at high voltages across the region to substations where it is stepped down into a lower voltage so it can enter our local distribution, or otherwise known as the retail system. So the power then hits our distribution lines. So these are the lines you might see around your community, up on wooden poles or sometimes buried underground, that carry the electricity from the transmission system to our homes and businesses where we consume it. And that side of the system is often referred to as the load. So the load on the system describes the consumers, us turning on our lights, plugging in our laptops, and consuming electricity. Of course, unlike the electric power system of the 19th century, we have some generation on the distribution side of the system too. So for instance, there are homes with solar photovoltaic panels on the roof. We have people with plugging in electric vehicles with storage batteries, or have storage systems in their homes or businesses. So you might hear those referred to as distributed energy resources, or DR or DER. So that term refers to generation that's not centrally located in utility scale, but is sort of distributed throughout the system. So as a recap, we have sort of these four pieces: generation, the transmission, the distribution, and the retail or load side, with the little wrinkle that there's also some generation on the distribution side too, as technology evolves. So who is in charge of making sure that all of these parts of the system work properly? So, traditionally, there was vertically integrated monopoly companies that owned all sets of the supply chain. They owned the power plants that generated the electricity, the transmission lines that carried it to the load, and the distribution system. But in the 1990s, the states in our region moved to a restructured or market-based system where we no longer allow, for the most part, one company to own all sets of the supply chain. We have different actors that are in charge of each step in the process. So we have independent power producers that fund power plants. We have companies that invest in transmission infrastructure. We have distribution companies, also known as utilities, who own the wires in our neighborhoods. So these are probably the entity that you're most familiar with, for instance, Eversource, National Grid, or Unitil. And then we have those companies and others, competitive suppliers or municipal aggregators, who are in charge of selling the electricity to the consumers to be used at the retail level. One exception, even though we are in a restructured or market-based system, we still allow municipal light plants to own other parts of the system. So that's just an important wrinkle. And so I really want to emphasize this important point that distribution companies cannot own power plants. They can't own renewable energy resources unless they have special permission from the legislature. Otherwise, they're just wires companies. So here's just a little map showing the status of restructuring around the country. So you can see that it varies across region. While a lot of the Northeast follows a restructured or market-based model, and much of the South and the Mountain West still follows a traditional cost of service model, where sort of one company owns all sides of the supply chain and they recover the cost for all of that directly from consumers. The reason that our region moved to a restructured model was that We thought that competition would reduce prices for consumers, and that it would put the risk of investing in some of these really capital intensive and risky projects on companies instead of consumers, and thereby make the whole system more efficient and more affordable for all the electricity users in the region. Here's a map that just describes which electricity providers serve different communities across the Commonwealth. So you can see in pink here, those are the municipal light plants. We have yellow up by Fitchburg, that is Unitil's territory. And we have in the two different kinds of greens of the lime green and the seafoam green, that's Eversource. And National Grid is in the purple. And I just wanted to note that, you might hear some different names of utilities like Wamiko or Western Massachusetts Electric Company or NSTAR Electric. And those are both now doing business as Eversource Energy. But the reason we have a bunch of different legacy names like that is that there was a lot of mergers and rebranding when we went through the restructuring process and over the ensuing years. And so don't be confused. We essentially have servicing the Commonwealth, the Eversource, National Grid, Unitil, and municipal light plants. So just noting that all of these municipal light plants that serve consumers deliver and sell electricity directly to local customers, but some of them do generate some of their own electricity. Okay, so now looking back at the stack of sort of the four parts of the system, who is in charge of making sure that all of these different entities work in coordination and keep the power system functioning properly? We do have some entities that oversee what's going on at the market level. So first, in the generation and transmission side of the system, we have the Independent System Operator, or ISO. Here in New England, our independent system operator is known affectionately as ISO New England, and they are overseen by a federal independent agency known as the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. And I'm going to talk in a little more detail in a minute about ISO New England and FERC, but they are the main coordinators of what's going on the wholesale side of the system. And on the retail side of the system, we have the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities, which is an independent state agency. Perhaps you have gone to a meeting in their offices over near South Station, and you've participated in the hearing that they've held or given comments. So that's the sort of the state regulation side of this system, and they oversee what the distribution companies do and the charges that they pass along to consumers and sort of what's happening on the retail side of the system. So ISO New England, why do we have this entity that oversees the wholesale side of the grid? Well, I have a little map here so you can see other similar independent system operators or regional transmission operators across the country. So there's a bunch that coordinate market operations. Was created back in the 90s with a few really key purposes. Mainly to maintain reliability and make sure that the system works well all of the time. It's really complex and it needs someone to sort of oversee it. So a few of the key purposes are to make sure that wholesale suppliers act in a competitive market, to ensure that there's non-discriminatory access to our transmission system, to do a lot of planning for the grid operations to make sure that the system is reliable given changes that we anticipate over time, to manage the interconnection of new resources. So when new power plants and new generation sources, for instance, are added to the system, to oversee the markets and make sure that no one is gaining too much market power or manipulating our rules, and to provide transparency about what's going on in the system and forum for the public to engage. So ISO New England is a nonprofit corporation. It follows a typical corporate structure. It has a president and a CEO. It has a lot of employees who help carry out all of those processes that I mentioned. It's overseen by a board of directors, and that board of directors is elected with input from other market participants and from the states. The region that ISO New England services covers the 6 New England states, so Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and most of Maine. And the budget that they use to fund all of this important work that they do is paid for by us consumers in our bills And for the average customer, it comes out to about $1 per month in the most recent budget. And ISO New England, although it's sort of this nonprofit, non-governmental entity that's independently overseeing our system, they are overseen by a federal regulatory body, and that is the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. The FERC is an independent and bipartisan agency that's in charge of regulating the interstate transmission and wholesale sale of electricity and gas, among other things. There are 5 FERC commissioners, and it's truly bipartisan. So by law, no more than 3 commissioners can be from the same party. So there's a mixture of Democrats and Republicans at all times. And it's independent in the sense that the president and Congress can't tell FERC what to decide or what to do. Only courts review the decisions that FERC comes up with. It acts almost as a sort of quasi-court-like body conducting proceedings and issuing decisions that are then, reviewable in a court. But these aren't the only key entities in ensuring that our system works and functions well. There are state players that play an important role too. So for instance, here in Massachusetts, our state legislature can direct the utilities to do certain things, like to procure certain types of power or to engage in certain types of planning processes. And the state legislature can also tell the Department of Public Utilities what to do through new legislation that they enact. The governor is the chief executive officer of our Commonwealth, and the governor's office also has a lot of influence on the system. The governor tells state agencies how to use their authority, for instance, the Department of Energy Resources or the Department of Environmental Protection. And the governor's office also has influence over the proceedings of ISO New England. And then here at the Attorney General's office, we advocate on behalf of Massachusetts electricity users before the Department of Public Utilities, before the ISO, and before FERC. So we play a really important role too. So thanks for coming on this brief journey with me, doing a quick overview of the power system. And I'm going to turn it back to Rebecca so we can talk more about the markets.
Hi, everyone. Megan, that was terrific. Really, really helpful. Next, we're going to hear from Tim Rapucci. So Tim, why don't you take it away?
Good morning. My name is Tim Rapucci. I'm an Assistant Attorney General here at the Attorney General's office in our Energy and Telecommunications Division, which acts as the ratepayer advocate for the state, as Megan just described. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the overall grid. And when I talk about the grid, I'm talking about New England and what ISO New England manages, and sort of where we've been in the past and where we're going in the future with that grid. Now, before we talk about this slide, I'm just going to tell you that a lot of the information that we took is from ISO New England, and we have a lot of charts and data from ISO New England. So if you're ever looking for background on what's going on with our grid, what fuels our grid, the demands on our grid, ISO New England's website is a great resource for so much information. And now looking at this slide, you'll see that we have the regional energy consumption for the past 20 years throughout New England. And this is again from ISO New England's data, measured in gigawatt hours. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with gigawatts and megawatts and kilowatts, a gigawatt is about 1 million kilowatts. And 1 kilowatt is about the consumption of 10 old-fashioned incandescent light bulbs and what they would consume at a moment in time. So what you get charged on your bills are kilowatt hours, and that unit is sort of like paying for a gallon of gas in that sense. And kilowatt hours represent the electricity of those 10 light bulbs and what they would consume if left on for 1 hour. For context, and looking at the big numbers on this chart, a Massachusetts home only uses about 650 kilowatt hours per month. When we add up all of the consumption from homes, businesses, factories in New England, we get the region's overall consumption. And if you look at this, demand and consumption for electricity in New England had grown for about 50 years. And in 2005, it peaked. And that's when our overall electricity use started to decline. And forecasts show, if you look at this chart, from about 2020 to the projection out to what's about 2029, that over the next decade, demand is going to remain relatively flat. This slide shows a different piece of data called annual peak consumption, measured in megawatts. And similarly, this covers from 2001 out to the future with a forecast. And peak consumption also peaked in 2005. Now, peak consumption is an important measure because we build out our transmission system to be able to handle delivery of this amount of energy to local utilities and ultimately consumers. It's basically how much we need to build out for to meet when everybody is trying to use the system in some sort of intense way all at once, probably the easy way to describe it. And we also need to build enough power plants to meet that peak need too. So the higher the peak consumption on the system, the more of a transmission system and the more transmission you need to deliver electricity to all people who are consuming it at that time. So in a little bit, Ben's going to talk to you, Ben Griffiths, who's an analyst in our office, about what happens when peak demand exceeds the transmission system's capacity to deliver electricity. But what you need to look at right now is that peak consumption, much like total consumption, isn't really doing much in terms of growth over the next decade. In fact, it looks like it's going to decline a bit until about 2025-26 and then begin to increase again. The decline in total consumption and peak consumption since 2005 may seem surprising, especially given that we seem to have an ever-expanding number of complex electronics at work in our homes, at our fingertips. So to answer the question, why have total consumption and peak consumption been declining since 2005? And why do we expect them to continue to decline at least a little bit in the future? The answer is energy efficiency. So energy efficiency efforts have been keeping electricity demand in check, and energy efficiency covers everything from the standards for light bulbs and consumer appliances to building insulation and building standards. In 1987, that was the first congressional act that was signed into law establishing energy efficiency standards for these appliances and different equipment. In 2005 and 2007, Congress made additional legislative changes to strengthen our energy efficiency standards. And throughout the Obama administration, that administration took a number of regulatory actions to strengthen energy efficiency standards through the Department of Energy. Also, states have energy efficiency programs, and Massachusetts is a very robust energy efficiency program that is administered by our utilities. And it has ranked first in the country in energy efficiency for years. Other New England states also have robust programs for energy efficiency. Looking at this graph, you'll see that ISO New England projects what peak summer demand will be out until 2029. The top line in this graph where it says gross peak, this is what would happen if we didn't have energy efficiency in the calculus of what our projections are going to be. And you'll see that the gross peak demand in the summer would be growing out until 2029 without energy efficiency. The next line down shows how that peak demand is affected by behind the meter solar, labeled PV here in this graph. But when you consider energy efficiency's effect on the system, again, what you see from 2020 to 2029 is pretty much a flat growth in the summer peak demand. And that's all thanks to these pretty aggressive measures that we've been taking for a while to make sure that when we use electricity, it is a lot more efficient and not as wasteful as it used to be. If you take all of the impact of energy efficiency into account in this graph, it basically is reducing consumption and peak demand by about 16 to 25% than it would be otherwise. So we talked about sort of the quantities of electricity that New England uses and the quantity for peak consumption, but let's take a look at where electricity comes from. Here you'll see a graph showing New England's generation mix starting back in 2000 until present. So generation mix basically just means who are all of the generators on the system creating electricity for us. And traditionally they've been, fossil fuel generators. and nuclear generators and some hydroelectric. So if you start in 2000, you'll see that a bit more than 25% of our electricity came from coal and oil generators at the bottom of the graph. About 30% came from nuclear generators, and less than 10% came from hydroelectric generators. Natural gas generators at that time were somewhere around 25% of what was providing electricity to our grid. And this graph tells what is the real big story of the last 20 years, which has been an ever decreasing contribution of coal and oil to our resource mix and the rise of natural gas. So coal and oil were once dominant, and coal consumption in New England has a pretty interesting story, mostly based on international politics. But as many of you know, New England is not Texas. We don't sit on top of oil fields and natural gas reserves. We have historically been an importer of fuels. So coal was a major part of New England's electricity mix, mostly because it was cheap and easy to transport into the region. New England's coal use peaked in the 60s and then plummeted afterwards, but global oil embargoes and the fuel shortages of the 1970s led to a bit of a resurgence of coal into the 1980s. Only after 2005 has coal use significantly decreased again. And the other part of the story of the past 2 decades has been the emergence of natural gas as the dominant source of electricity supply in New England. You'll see that today more than half of our generation comes from natural gas, and that coal and oil contribute very little to our electricity resource mix. In 2019, about 0.1% of the electricity mix came from oil generators and 0.4% came from coal generators. So in total, that is about 0.5% came from coal and oil, which used to have a much bigger role here. And you might ask yourself, how did natural gas come to predominate in the last 10 years? So Meg described for you and started to introduce ISO New England's energy markets, which Ben Griffiths is going to talk to you more about later. But what you need to know for this story is that for the most part, with some caveats, ISO New England has rules for its electricity markets that tend to favor the cheapest producers of electricity. The price of natural gas has plummeted due to improvements in fracking technology in the mid-2000s. And essentially under most circumstances, it has been a lot more economic to produce electricity from natural gas than it has been to produce oil and coal since those improvements happened and gas has become a lot cheaper. But if we want to consider the future, take a look on this graph around 2010 and 2011. In that time frame, at the top of the graph, in what is green and yellow, sort of a yellow-orange, that is the story of wind and solar starting to contribute to our resource mix on the grid. And we're going to talk more about that as we start to look at projections out to the future. But before we get to the next slide, if you want to know more about today's resource mix, ISO New England actually has this fantastic smartphone app that allows you to see what resources are producing electricity for our grid in real time throughout the day. It's got great pie charts, and you can see the percentage of what is providing electricity to our system, including natural gas and renewables and other sources. The app also has great information about wholesale electricity prices throughout different parts of New England, so you can see how different parts of the day affect the cost of electricity and the current demand on our system. So looking at the future, this is a graph taken from ISO New England's 2020 Regional Electricity Outlook, and it shows how the ISO New England expects our resource mix to change based on what are called interconnection requests by new generators, which are basically requests to connect to the grid so that those generators can sell their energy into ISO's markets, and ISO's assessment of which generators it thinks it will retire in the next decade, as well as some other sources of data. The numbers here are provided in terms of megawatts and are an estimate of the capacity of the types of resources on the system. So for background, again, ISO New England needs to think of the total mix of electricity resources in the system in terms of total capacity. Basically, how many megawatts can all of the resources produce when needed, and what is available at any given moment in time to the system to meet its needs. So for each resource shown here, the bar on the left is the status of capacity contributions from that resource in 2019, which I believe, except for coal, that might be a 2018 number. And looking at coal in particular at the far end of the graph, you'll see that ISO New England expects coal capacity in terms of megawatts to be 0 by 2029, meaning that it expects that in the next decade, all of the region's remaining coal generators will retire by that point. If you look at oil, you'll see a decrease in capacity, which reflects some anticipation of retirements, but obviously that is not as steep as what has happened and is happening with coal, and not as much of a quick process of what has happened to coal generators in the region. Natural gas, if you go to the middle of the graph in light blue, is expected to sort of retain its place as the predominant source of capacity throughout the next decade. But again, the future, if you take a look at wind, shows a dramatic increase in renewables, particularly wind. Wind capacity is expected to increase dramatically, and this projection comes from active interconnection requests that are at ISO New England at the moment, and that's the number of projects people are trying to start and get going in terms of providing wind to the region. So ISO New England also expects solar to increase significantly in the region. That's also based on interconnection requests, what's in that queue, and what projects are anticipated to be added beyond that. On the green bars, you'll see energy efficiency. These are estimates of how energy efficiency is expected to make further contributions to limiting our energy use. And lastly, far to the left of the graph, is electric battery storage, which is expected to provide contributions to the grid as well. This is based on interconnection requests in ISO's queue. And batteries are going to be very important for helping integrate all of that wind and solar that's being proposed and projected to join our resource mix. So here in this slide, you'll see we have a bit of a deeper dive on wind and solar. Predominantly, it's expected that much of the contribution of wind to our resource mix is going to come from offshore wind. So something like 95% of all new wind is expected to be offshore in New England, and predominantly located south of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard in that area of the Cape and the islands. 60% of the proposed wind projects are offshore Massachusetts projects, and about 30 are Connecticut projects, with some in Rhode Island. We have a much smaller share anticipated of onshore wind, which is actually a big resource in Texas and parts of the Midwest and the Plains, but not anticipated to be so much as part of our mix here. We are really leaning in on offshore wind at the moment. So what has driven these increases in wind projects has been a lot of technological developments, but also state policies. States like Massachusetts have engaged in large-scale state procurement initiatives to help get renewable sources off the ground and start contributing to our resource mix. Interestingly, wind provides what we can sort of call a homegrown electricity source for New England. What fuels the generator, wind, doesn't need to be imported like oil, natural gas, uranium, or coal, which are all fuels that we've had to import into the region to fuel our generators in the past. So I've talked about where we've been in terms of electricity generation and who's been providing that generation and where we think we're going. And obviously, an important part of the story is how all of that impacts our net zero goals here in Massachusetts and the goals of the other states throughout the region in terms of reaching emissions reductions for climate goals. So the change in New England's electricity resource mix over the past 2 decades has already impacted greenhouse gas emissions. As the system has moved away from coal and oil and increased its use of modern, efficient natural gas generators, the grid has seen a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. It's important to note that the greenhouse gas emission measures that are often shown in this chart and others don't encompass all greenhouse gas emissions associated with natural gas, specifically the extraction and production of natural gas and any leaks associated with gas delivery, either interstate or within our state and the system that you rely on from your utility. However, the reduction in coal and oil usage has contributed to a cleaner New England grid, especially if you consider some of the other pollutants that are emitted by coal in particular. So this graph on this chart you'll see is from the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs and was provided in their 10-year report on the Massachusetts Global Warming Solutions Act. So the Global Warming Solutions Act was enacted in 2008, and it set for Massachusetts greenhouse gas emission reduction limits of 25% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions below a 1990 baseline level by 2020. So we're supposed to be at a 25% reduction by the end of this year. And then looking forward, the reduction is supposed to continue to an 80% reduction by 2050. In April of this year, the Baker administration established a 2050 emissions limit of net zero greenhouse gas emissions. So this has pretty much made a more stringent emissions limit than what we had under the Act by itself. And as for this 10-year report and this data here, the data is through 2016. So we don't have the data right now up through 2020, but you'll see that from about 2005 on this graph at the very top of all these layered colors that we've had a decrease in greenhouse gas emissions out through 2016. If you look at the end of the chart, there's a little dot around 70 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is where we hope to be by the end of this year to meet our 25% reduction goal. Now, a lot of the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions sort of economy-wide in Massachusetts has come from the changes in our electric grid. So that green portion at the top of the grid, you'll see how much it has started to decrease in size as we get to 2015. But the grid also tells you an important part of the story as well. I apologize, the graph shows you that this is an important part of the story, that it's not just the grid we have to worry about. Greening the grid is only one part of the emissions story and trying to meet our goals. A large part of our emissions at the end of this graph in 2016 came from the transportation sector, which includes personal vehicles that run on gasoline. And as a result, Massachusetts has been finding ways to create incentives for electric vehicle ownership and use. You'll also see that as of 2016, emissions from the residential and commercial and industrial sectors, those emissions have not decreased much. Many of you likely know that in New England, oil has historically been a major source of home heating. Natural gas now provides home heating to a lot of Massachusetts residents. And to address the residential sector emissions, a number of states are continuing to take further steps to encourage what is the electrification of heat. So getting people off of both oil and natural gas and over onto electric sources that'll be part of what is hopefully a cleaner grid. So for example, Maine has an ambitious target of installing 100,000 heat pumps in residential homes by 2050 to help its residents get off of oil predominantly. And in 2019, when this was proposed, I believe, oil was supplying about more than 60% of Maine homes with heat. In Massachusetts, for many years, we've been providing incentives for residents to switch from oil to natural gas. And that makes a lot of sense if you look at where our emissions have gone as the grid has changed from oil and more over to natural gas. But today we're encouraging the use of heat pumps through rebates and incentives to start a new transition from natural gas to electrification to some extent. Now the state is committed to finding ways to encourage commercial building electrification as well, not just residences, while continuing to harness energy efficiency improvements for those large buildings that for the technology that may not exist quite yet to get them to full electrification. You'll notice that the greenhouse gas reduction goals for non-electricity sectors that I've just discussed pretty much rely on a strategy of electrification. So that means adding more people to the electricity system and adding more people to the grid. So what that'll entail as we do that with both vehicles and different buildings that aren't on the grid now for major uses like heat, we're going to need to start making the right kind of investments to expand transmission capacity on the grid to be able to handle the results of this electrification strategy. And policymakers are already thinking of ways to deal with the need for building out and improving electricity transmission, as well as the distribution systems that Meg described that handle the delivery of electricity directly from your local utility to you as a consumer. Some of the creative ways also involve thinking about how we change the way we use electricity. So for example, New Jersey has in its recent 80% by 2050 report, which is the goal that they've set. They mentioned a solution in this report that might involve changing the way we look at how we use electricity through time of use rates. Basically finding ways to incentivize people to use electricity to the extent they can at off-peak times so we don't impact that peak demand, which is the thing that really drives the build out of our transmission system. From what I've described, it should be no surprise that we think there's a lot more to do to get to net zero by 2050. So here's another chart from the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, the EEA, as we call it, projecting how we get to net zero and what that looks like by sector. Similar to the last graph, you'll see at the bottom, we're talking about different sectors like transportation, electricity consumption, buildings, and those reductions to get there, to get to net zero, involve sort of an interesting way of looking at how we think about net zero emissions. So that doesn't necessarily mean that we're not having any greenhouse gas emissions in our economy by 2050, according to this plan. The green hatch section of this graph shows sort of the give and take of what net zero means. And so some of the strategy involves relying on replacing current fuels that we use, especially for, heavy industry and transportation, with lower carbon substitutes. And it means relying on carbon capture resources like our forests, which act as carbon sinks that will take some of the greenhouse gas emissions, carbon, out of the air. And also potentially future technologies that will allow us to capture carbon emissions. As sort of a side note here, there is some technology today that for carbon capture, it's mostly in the form of capturing carbon off of fossil fuel burning plants, but there are complications with that associated with expense and the costs that those cause, and also where we store that carbon after it's captured. So as states look forward to as we look forward to our net zero scenario and trying to get there, and other states are doing this as well, we're looking at ways of balancing out what emissions might still be there by 2050. Some of that also includes leveraging methane emissions from waste and refuse to produce energy rather than just letting those emissions dissipate into the atmosphere. Massachusetts policymakers have been working on modeling how we get to net zero by 2050. And we don't have the results of that yet, but Massachusetts will be releasing the results of these studies, we believe sometime this month, for comparison, because they're close to us and have similar weather patterns and similar priorities. Here's just a graph showing sort of the complicated nature of modeling the scenarios to get to either 80% reductions or net zero by 2050 that New Jersey published. And you'll see in this graph, mostly just take a look at the orange yellow and the blue for offshore wind. You'll see that a lot of these, what are variations, different models of getting there, really rely on dramatic increases in solar and wind and storage to do that. At the far left of this graph, you'll see it says least cost. Every state's trying to figure out also, like, what's the cheapest way to get there? How can we get our system to net zero in a way that doesn't overly increase the costs of getting there than we have to? And even in those scenarios, that requires these renewable sources to increase dramatically. So here you'll see a lot of solar in this graph. Massachusetts appears to be leaning pretty heavily on offshore wind to reach our goals. A recent presentation by the EEA at a roundtable suggested that our least cost pathway for getting to net zero would require about more than 25 gigawatts of wind capacity, which is the equivalent of building one big offshore wind farm every year for the next 30 years to get there. So there's a lot to do to try to reach those goals through these methods. In addition to renewable capacity, however, energy efficiency and overall reduction or changes in energy use remain crucial factors in the pathways that states have modeled to try to get to their climate goals. So we can't stress enough how at the beginning of this presentation, we talked about the dramatic impact of energy efficiency. There's still more work to do there and more to leverage there to try to get us where we need to go. In conclusion, I think it's fair to say that policymakers and industry and engineers are exploring exactly what the pathways to our net zero goals will look like, what our grid is going to look like as a result, and specifically trying to figure out how do we get there without spending more money than we need to and imposing that on consumers. So I hope this is a good background on just kind of what our electricity usage look like, where we think it's going, and how that interacts with our net zero goals. And I've talked a lot about, electricity generation sources, but you're going to hear next from Ben Griffiths, our analysis, about how those sources that generate the electricity actually sell that electricity into markets, and how that electricity through those markets eventually gets to utilities and people's homes. I believe we're about to take a 5-minute break, so we'll conclude here, and you'll hear from Ben in about 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, so we have had 2 parts of our educational component, and we have 2 more coming up. And the first one is as Ben likes to say, a gentle introduction to the wholesale markets. After Ben, we'll have 1 more focusing on knee pool, and then we'll do the question and answer session. So Ben, good to see you. Take it away.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ben Griffiths. I'm an analyst working in the Energy and Environmental Bureau. I spend all my time, or almost all my time, on wholesale markets, which in point of fact means sitting in a ballroom in Westboro, hashing these things out with many other stakeholders. So first, I just want to get something out of the way, and that's that power systems are really, really complicated. So Meg described sort of all the different components that are there. Tim described how we have sort of all these power plants working together. But even New England's relatively small power system weaves together something like 350 dispatchable power plants. Those are the natural gas units, the hydro, the nuclear plants, something like 50 wind farms across the region, 180,000 solar facilities, and that's ranging from small rooftop ones to large, the large ones you see in fields if you're driving down the pike or other places. And on the other side, millions of customers. And somehow we're able to go manage all of those power plants to match that consumer demand every second of the day, every day of the year. And so I think it's no surprise that the National Academy of Engineering called it the greatest achievement of the 20th century, right? So it beats out rocket ships, it beats out computers as sort of the greatest engineering marvel that we've done. And this is only going to get more complicated as time goes on, as we start talking about more energy storage, more wind and solar, because many of those units are much smaller than conventional power plants, where say a gas plant might be say 500 megawatts, a wind farm might be 50 or 100, and solar can be much, much smaller still. So how do we coordinate it all, right? How do we make sure that supply and demand are meeting, that we're able to serve customer demand? And the answer broadly is markets. So we've built markets to ensure the safe, reliable, and affordable operation of the power system, because to make sure that we're meeting what consumers want 24/7, 365. And more specifically, we've designated the ISO New England to do that. And so they manage that job from all across the region, from Connecticut to Maine, and we designate them to do it on timescales ranging from seconds to years. So we want to make sure that sort of over all possible timeframes that we're coordinating and that we're keeping everything in sync. And while that might sound sort of complicated to be using markets to do that, I think it's worth pointing out that these markets, while they're certainly, tailored to electricity, they share a lot of common foundation with markets for anything, be it gasoline or potatoes. Right? We really like markets because they ensure the efficient allocation of resources, or very often can. That they can ensure that new kinds of technologies that are able to provide good benefits to consumers can enter the market. They can spur innovation. It can create incentives to go encourage the development of new resources. And I guess at the same time, if things are maybe a little long in the tooth, markets can also help encourage those resources to leave. So New England has three major classes of markets. There's the energy market, the ancillary services, which is a suite of markets, and the forward capacity market. So the energy market is the one that probably most people think about when we think about electricity. That's basically where the ISO goes out and buys energy to meet demand in every hour of the year, and it tries to do that in the cheapest way it can. And so that functionally is the thing that is coming through your socket when you turn on your lights. And then we have sort of two sets of markets to help ensure that we actually can do that 24/7. So the first thing we have is ancillary services. And the goal of this market is basically to maintain reliability over seconds to hours. So if we need to keep the market in sync on a very, very fast basis, we use ancillary services to keep things trued up every 4 seconds. We also have ancillary services to help step in if something breaks down. And we also actually have them to sort of reboot the grid should there be a blackout. Finally, we have a thing called the forward capacity market. The forward capacity market is designed to ensure that the region has enough power plants to always be able to produce electricity in any hour of the year. And it also is the one market that we have explicitly designed to go encourage the development of new power plants if there is insufficient, if we don't think we have enough of them. So the energy and ancillary services are basically about running the power plants that we have. The forward capacity market is about building new ones or maintaining the ones we have on that sort of longer multiple year timescale. So just to put this in context in terms of money, we talked about how the energy market is the biggest, but it's a lot bigger than the others. And so this chart shows sort of cost for the whole region, 2008 to 2020. And what we can see is that the energy market in that sort of teal color is far and away the largest one. And the ancillary services, those things designed to true up consumption sort of minute to minute or second to second, is hardly even registers. Finally, we have the forward capacity market, and that number is perhaps the most volatile, but even still, it's a relatively small, or it's somewhere between 10% and about half of the overall market. And that one is very volatile just because the situation of what power plants we have is it's a lumpier problem. And so some years we have more than enough, and other years we're a little bit short. Importantly, over the next few years, capacity costs are going to keep falling. And so even though it's a relatively big slice for 2020, those numbers will keep declining in the next years to come. So now we're going to turn to each of these markets and examine them in a little more detail. So the energy market is conceptually where power plants sell electricity to buyers. So buyers aren't you and me, instead they're utilities, municipal aggregations, competitive suppliers, things like that. So many retail consumers all lumped together. And the energy market is basically a place where we set the price of electricity for every hour based on supply and demand. In this case, supply is what power plants are available and willing to sell electricity at what price. And demand is basically how much consumption consumers like you and me have for that period of time. Power plants are selected to run based on their economic merit for each hour. And economic merit is just sort of a fancy way of saying cost. We want to select the cheapest set of power plants to run such that we can meet all of the consumption desires we have, but also that we can ensure reliability. And so that means that prices might vary over the course of the day, just depending on how much consumption we have. And they also vary over the course of the year, just depending on, say, the price of fuel. So like most economic markets, power plants would get paid the same price for the same service. So the idea here is that, you know, 1 unit of electricity is equally valuable if it comes from a nuke or a gas generator or you know, a solar farm. And so we want to pay each power plant the same price for that energy. And it's important to note that this market, sort of based on that principle, is technology and emissions neutral. There's no explicit preference for that wind turbine versus the gas plant. There's no sort of explicit acknowledgement of emissions, carbon emissions or any other kind. Sort of implicitly, at least in New England, carbon costs are at least accounted for through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is an 11-state carbon market, and the price for carbon in that market is about $6. So that cost of carbon is sort of embedded in what it costs a power plant to sell electricity, but there's no sort of formal acknowledgement of that emissions beyond that state level program. And I think it's worth just taking a minute to really sort of work through what does it mean that power prices are changing all the time and sort of think through why that might be the case. So on this chart, or on this slide, we have 2 components. On the left, we have demand. On the right, we have supply. So this is looking at a sort of a hot summer day. And this sort of curve where we have a trough in the early morning hours on the sort of lower left, then over the course of the day, consumption rises and rises and rises until hour ending 18, which is like 6 p.m. And then it declines again as we enter the evening hours. And the specific shape will vary day to day. In the summer and the winter, the whole thing is a little bit higher, as in we're using more electricity. In the spring and fall, it's a little bit lower just because generally the weather is nice and we don't have as much sort of space conditioning needs, either heating or cooling. On the right, we have the offer curve. The offer curve represents what each power plant is willing to sell its electricity for, and it's sort of sorted from cheapest to most expensive. So in the very bottom left, we have power plants that are really cheap to run, and that might be your wind, your solar. A little higher than that, you might have nuclear. Then you have this sort of long belly, at least in this chart, sort of depicted in the gray tone, and that's sort of current modern natural gas power plants. And there's a whole lot of those on the system, as Tim noted, and they're all in the same sort of cost range. And then on the very extreme, on the far right, the price of electricity goes up quite quickly as you have a set of power plants that are quite expensive and inefficient to run. So they're really helpful because they maybe help, if you only need to run them, say, a couple hours a year, that might be a good value to have a relatively cheap one to operate. It's cheap to build, expensive to run. Other ones, like the nuke, might be expensive to build but cheap to run. So we want a trade-off or a sort of a portfolio of power plants to help balance and minimize our overall system cost. So we're going to look at 2 hours to sort of describe how prices change. So first we have, if we look at the left chart, we have a dashed line running through 9 a.m. And what we can see is that demand in that hour, looking at the axis, is about 15,000 megawatts or 15,000 megawatt hours. And when we then look to see if we stacked all the power plants up, who would we need to run, we end up with that one gray power plant. And we look at the price it wants to sell electricity for, and we see that that's about, say, $35. So in that hour, 9 a.m., the price of electricity is going to be $35. As demand keeps climbing, we need to start turning on or using more of those power plants to the right of that dashed line. And so by that later sort of dashed line at 6 p.m., we're now in that bright orange bucket. And now the price of electricity is something like $130 instead of just $30. But thankfully, that's a pretty short duration need. And so by mid-evening, again, we're down into those 30s, 40s, $50s range. And the specifics will, of course, vary day to day. The price of many of the underlying fuels that power plants consume vary day to day. but that sort of principle holds in general all across the region every day. So it is worth noting though, and just on that prior comment, every one of those power plants that was selected to the left of those lines, to the left of these lines, gets paid that same price based on that uniform clearing principle. So in that hour when all the electricity is at $130, every power plant, the nuke, the gas units, the wind farms, all get paid $130. So that's a really sort of important concept that's true of energy markets, but also just true of markets in general. So I would also note though that there are a couple of wrinkles. The first wrinkle is that prices can actually vary a little bit across the region. And that's basically due to a thing called congestion. Congestion is conceptually similar to a traffic jam on a highway, right? Only so much electricity can go between different parts of the states. And so if the transmission lines are congested, it's sort of equivalent to a traffic jam. And so, for example, in this chart on the left, we can see that Maine has prices in this particular moment in time that are significantly higher than the rest of the region. And basically that low cost electricity that you could get in Massachusetts or New Hampshire can't actually flow all the way up to Maine. And so Maine is stuck with this elevated price compared to the rest of the region. It also actually can work potentially in the other way too. And even as the chart on the right shows, it can actually go negative. So prices can be zero, or believe it or not, in that second example in Maine, you could actually get paid on a wholesale level a few cents to take electricity from somebody rather than having to pay for the privilege. And so while power prices vary a lot hour to hour, over the course of the year, prices are actually pretty stable. So this chart sort of returns to the previous ones, but it shows that sort of between 2008 and 2019, that prices have averaged about $40 or $42. And if you look at it, and you sort of think back to cold winters, what we can actually see is that the prices in 2013 and 14, and again in 2018, all years that had these really cold, hard winters, had higher than normal electricity prices. And that's because, in large part, the price of natural gas drives the price of electricity. And that's because, as Tim noted, there are so many natural gas power plants, and in so much of the time, they're the one that you will turn on if you need a little bit more electricity. They're the marginal power plant, so to speak. So the correlation between electricity and gas is described in this chart. And if you just squint, you can see that those two things are pretty highly correlated. And they're correlated, and you can sort of see two trends. First is like that if you sort of have these broader regional trends, and that could be things like hurricanes hitting the Gulf of Mexico, where a lot of natural gas is produced, and this is more of a New England specific phenomenon, you can see these high prices in the cold winter months in, say, 2012, 13, 14, 17, 18. And the story there is that we have, as Tim noted, we're on the end of the pipelines for natural gas. So gas comes from either down in Louisiana and Texas, or it comes from shales in the sort of western Pennsylvania and places like that. But because we're on the end of the pipe in the very cold winter months, those pipes get full. And so the marginal price of gas on those pipes becomes very, very high, where maybe in a normal hour or a normal day, gas costs $3 per unit. In those bad winters, it can be 25 or 30, so 10 times more. And consequently, the price of electricity also rises dramatically in those hours. So what we've talked about so far is sort of a conceptual framework for how the energy market works. But I think it's worth noting that, broadly speaking, clean energy resources do and can participate in these markets relatively unencumbered. So wind plants, solar plants, they can and do participate today. Very small ones mostly just take the prices that are given to them, whereas larger ones have to be more of a full market participant, trying to estimate their output for every hour based on weather forecasts and things like this. Energy storage has actually participated in the New England markets for almost 50 years. not as batteries, but instead sort of this technology known as pump storage hydro, which basically is imagine two reservoirs, a low one and a high one, and the technology pumps water uphill in the middle of the night when power prices are cheap, and then it discharges it from the top reservoir in the during sort of high demand periods. And so this is sort of technically speaking, it's energy storage. And we've actually built two of the largest pump storage facilities in the country, and we've had them since the 60s and 70s. So energy storage does participate in the markets, but I think the sort of the real future or the real adaptation of the energy market is going to be the allowing of ever smaller participants to join. So FERC over the last, say, 10 years has released a series of requirements that tells system operators like ISO New England that either both different kinds of resources that are maybe less conventional, so that could be things like demand response, which basically pays people for consuming less electricity during peak hours, or energy storage, or very small power plants must be able to be allowed to participate. And just this fall, FERC issued Order 2222, which sets a new set of requirements to allow for bundling of very small resources. Imagine a neighborhood worth of rooftop solar, that we're going to have to start allowing those technologies to participate in the wholesale markets. So it's not to say that we sort of reached the conclusion of this, but I think it's safe to say that the energy markets are quickly evolving to accept the suite of technologies that are entering the market today, and I think will likely drive our clean energy future. So turning next to ancillary services. Ancillary services, as you'll recall, are the things to fill in the gaps, to keep power flowing 24/7, to sort of work with or in concert with the energy market. And because power plants have to be kept in sync in all the time, we need things to help do that truing up. And so ancillary services are that tool. So we have some ancillary services that are used to true up demand every 4 seconds. We have some ancillary services that are designed to basically to keep a power plant in reserve to step in case something unexpectedly breaks. And we also have some ancillary services designed to basically reboot the grid if a blackout occurs. And sort of ironically, I guess, many power plants can't actually turn on without electricity. So if the grid is down, they can't turn back on. And so you basically need some power plants that can turn on all by themselves. And so we do pay for that privilege, and that's and just like everybody else. And it's worth pointing out here, or perhaps somewhere else, but we'll do it here, that this suite of products has done an extraordinarily good job at keeping the system reliable. Blackouts on a grid scale are vanishingly rare. So we've had in the Northeast 2 blackouts on the wholesale side, one in 1965, one in 2003. So we've managed to operate our power plants and just the grid as a whole with an astonishing degree, at least astonishing to me, degree of accuracy and reliability. So the question I think going forward though is, do we have the right suite of ancillary services to meet our 21st century needs? So what we historically had did a really great job of working with and around large rotating machines. And that's sort of all the conventional power plants that your mind's eye will conceive of. But the power plants of the future have some different properties, right? They might be energy limited, right? A battery only has so much juice in it. A wind plant can only produce electricity when it's windy, or a solar plant only when it's sunny. And so we might need to start expanding the suite of ancillary services that we have to ensure that we can keep the system reliable going forward under these new sorts of technologies. So that might be a ramping product, for example, that helps ensure that as solar output declines in the evening hours, that something can quickly take its place. that might be contingency products to account for forecast uncertainty, because weather forecasts are going to start dominating or accounting for a large fraction of the overall uncertainty in how we run our system. So imagine that a heat wave comes through the region a couple hours before we expected that. We need to be prepared. And we might also need sort of frequency regulation or other products on a very technical level, just to make sure that all the power plants are in sync and working together. And so while there's significant work to be done on sort of ancillary services, I think there's no reason to assume it can't successfully be done. And we've already seen other regions successfully integrate significantly higher shares of renewables than we do. So we've seen, so this chart from NREL shows that the fraction of annual energy coming from wind and solar resources for each of those RTOs or ISOs across the country that Meg depicted earlier on. So we're ISO New England, the third one from the left, and you'll see that as of 2018, only about 5% of our annual energy is coming from wind and solar. If you look all the way on the left though, you'll see California. California has something like 23% in 2018 and more like 25% now coming from those same technologies over the course of the year. So that's 5 times more. ERCOT and SPP, the other two high areas are Texas and the Great Plains. And those regions have seen annual energy from wind being 20 to 25%. And in specific hours, you're seeing north of 60%. So California had an hour where more than 62% of energy was coming from wind and solar, with 40% of it coming from solar and 20% from wind. SPP and ERCOT have seen 60% wind in some hours. So while we're going to need to make sure that we keep the system reliable, New England has the benefit of being able to look to some of those other regions to figure out how to successfully integrate, wind and solar and storage and these other new technologies. So now we're going to move on perhaps to the most esoteric, but in some ways the most important of the markets that we currently have, the forward capacity market. So the forward capacity market is designed to ensure that we have enough power plants on the system to produce electricity when demand's at its highest. So that could be a really hot summer day, for example. And that need is known in the engineering lingo as resource adequacy, right? We need to have an adequate number of power plants to meet demand. And this is kind of a weird concept because for most things, we only pay for the things that we actually use, right? If I want another bag of potatoes, I pay only for that next bag of potatoes. But for the capacity market, we're basically paying for the potential to use something, not the thing itself. And so there's maybe 2 helpful analogies, or maybe unhelpful depending. So the first one is that you can think of it like an insurance product, where you're trying to buy enough power plants to ensure that we can produce electricity year round, even if in 99% of the time, or even higher than that, you don't actually need it. I tend to fall back to a gym and gym membership analogy. On January 2nd, after everybody made their resolutions and signed up for the gym, they go. And so that's going to be the sort of peak gym going day of the year. And we're going to build gyms to satisfy all of those people trying to do right by their resolutions. And we actually pay our memberships based on that. We pay the membership every month. And so at least when I get, I start slacking off, I keep paying my membership even though I stopped going, maybe even by February, right? And so for 11 months of the year, I'm paying for the privilege of being able to go to the gym, even if I'm not actually there. And so that's sort of how the FCM works. That's how the forward capacity market works. We're paying for the privilege of power plants being able to produce electricity when they're needed, even if we don't think that they're going to be needed very much. And so unlike the energy market or the ancillary services, this is actually designed to procure new power plants if we need them, or sort of help retire out older, less cost-effective ones. And so it works in tandem with those other markets to attract and sustain power plants. And over the years, it's helped finance something like 12,000 megawatts of new generation, which is 30%, 40% over the last 10 years turnover in that fleet. And it's also helped build more energy efficiency, more demand response, more renewables, more natural gas. And at the same time, it's turned out that some of those other technologies are more cost effective, and it's helped retire out about 7,000 megawatts of older fossil and nuclear plants. So when Tim talks about how coal generation has all but disappeared, that's some of the 7,000 megawatts of fossil that's retired. And I think perhaps the reason that this is such a contentious market, though, is that the ability to generate electricity is not the same thing as actually generating electricity. And so this chart shows who's actually participating and getting paid through the capacity market over the past decade. And in those lower gray bars, we have various kinds of fossil. So that's coal, oil, and gas. On the upper half of the stack, we have those colored bars, which are things like nuclear, hydro, storage, solar, wind, and then energy efficiency is in the top in that lilac color. But what you can see is that even though Tim showed us that coal and oil produce almost no electricity over the course of the year, they're still making up about 20% of the overall capacity obligations. They're getting paid through this market. At the same time, in the sort of upper right, you can see those wind, solar, storage technologies that I think a lot of people envision as being essential to the future of our grid. And you'll see that they only make up something like 5% of the capacity market. And I think that disjoint between sort of existing legacy resources getting paid through the capacity market despite not actually running, while at the same time having those clean technologies actually running but not really participating, some people look at that and say that something isn't quite working right and we maybe need to reinvestigate it. And to some degree, the explanation or that the disjointness comes back to sort of what the goal itself is, right? The goal of the capacity market isn't to go produce or buy wind and solar plants. It's simply to make sure that we have enough capacity to produce electricity year round. So it's technology neutral. And it's simply focusing on that one goal. And there's been a bunch of research done that basically indicates that the capacity market tends to favor power plants that can produce electricity or that are really cheap to build and expensive to run. And if you think about what it costs for wind and solar, that's kind of the opposite. Wind plants, solar plants are expensive to build, cheap to run. And so there might be some sort of structural or economic level explanations for what's going on there, why we're seeing so much more of such a hard time for clean energy resources to be entering this market. But the other reason has to do with rules. And it's hard in part for clean energy resources to participate because of a set of rules that basically say that if you have a long-term contract from a state or somebody else, that you don't get to include those benefits when you try to participate. So say you have a business proposition for a wind farm that's a really great deal if you account for a long-term contract from the state. The ISO will say, despite the fact that you actually have that contract in the real world, you can't account for that when we look at your economics. And so they'll pull that money out and then say, well, now it looks like you have a much more crummy offer. And so it's unlikely that you're going to be able to clear in the market to actually participate because your costs, if you exclude the actual revenues that you're actually receiving, look pretty bad. Now, if you to make up for some of that, the region built a thing called Casper, which is this special sub-auction to try to allow for these policy resources to participate, to basically one-for-one swap out with retiring power plants. But we've at least observed that it doesn't seem to be happening in practice. So over the last 3 auctions, something like 47 megawatts of clean energy from an offshore wind facility have entered the market, despite many times that seeking to enter. And I think when we talk about what's going on here, in large part, this is a story about a missing attribute, right? So far we've talked about creating safe, reliable, affordable electricity, but nowhere in there is any notion of the word clean. And it's worth, I think, thinking about why that's the case. And so the ISO New England markets, like markets for energy around the country, were developed and have been largely successful in solving the problem of the 20th century, which is basically how do you produce electricity cheaply and affordably and reliably. And I think in that paradigm, they've been broadly successful. But today, the New England states, many of you are concerned that not only do we need to have it to be safe and reliable, but we also need it to be clean, or at least cleaner. And one of the problems that we have today with our markets is that there's no formal accounting for clean. So the states have this goal to help foster a cleaner grid. And Tim talked about some of the ways that we're doing that. But the markets don't reflect those goals. And because of that, it means that our markets might end up being more expensive or dirtier than they need to be. Right? If you don't, one issue with markets is if you only buy the things that you seek. And if clean isn't one of the things that is explicitly sought, you might not get it. And so we talked about one of those examples already with the issue of minimum offer price rules and the capacity market. But that's also seen in many other aspects. Some of you might think, well, the energy market is sort of saying that every resource gets paid the same amount of money per unit sold, but maybe clean resources have a special cleanliness attribute to them that's different from a gas plant. The states already in part account for that through things called renewable energy credits, but that's not part of the wholesale market. And I think this is a broad problem in many jurisdictions, not just Massachusetts or New England, but it's also, I think, a pretty hard nut to crack. So the region tried to do this effort in a process called IMAP back in 2016, which was largely unsuccessful. More recently, we've started up a thing called the Future Grid Proceeding at NEPOOL, and we're trying to go do it again. And I don't want to sort of say that there's an obvious path forward, but I think there are a variety of things that we can do that would, or some combination of these things that might be helpful. So in the energy market, for example, more explicit or meaningful carbon pricing might be helpful, right? And so carbon pricing is currently done through RGGI at about $6 per ton. But if you think about what the sort of social cost of carbon or what the right number is, it's probably somewhat higher than that, maybe a lot higher than that, depending on your perspective. Another concept is called scarcity pricing. And in that story, you allow the price of energy to go up very, very high in occasional hours when the system is really stressed. And the idea here is that a resource like a solar plant or a battery might be able to see that really high price and quickly react to it. So you might, and so if you don't have those high prices, you might not ever allow the economics of the battery to really blossom. But if you allow prices to be more variable, maybe storage could more easily participate. On the side of ancillary services, one part that we might want to do is just unbundle our products, right? Or maybe just create new products to reflect all of the different needs that we have on the system. So when we talk about unbundling, for example, a wind farm you can always turn down its output, but you can't turn its output up. So maybe we should create a product so if we currently have a product that says you must be able to go up or down by 5 units, maybe we should create 2 products, one that says you can go up by 5 units and a different product that says you can go down by 5 units. Then you could have a wind farm at least participate in one of those 2 markets rather than not participating at all. And finally, and I think this is the realm which is most important, but likely the murkiest, is maybe we just need to make deep changes to the forward capacity market. Maybe we need to change the thing that we're technically buying. Maybe we should just get rid of it. Maybe there's some way that we could integrate clean energy into it, right? Maybe we could say, I want to buy megawatts of reliability, but also megawatt, and some fraction of that coming from clean technologies. Or maybe we just create a 4th market, a market just for clean energy explicitly. And we don't have that market today. And so maybe it would be helpful if we said something like, we want to buy 30% of electricity through a wholesale market for clean electricity. And I don't want to leave you with any particular insight as to which of those paths are most productive. I think there's a lot of smart people who have varying opinions on which path forward is the right one. But I think it's one of those topics which is going to be sort of this is the next decade of our issues. So just in conclusion, just take away that power is a commodity just like any other, that it's markets and that we use markets as an efficient way to buy and sell it, that wholesale markets have been largely successful at those goals of buying safe, reliable, affordable electricity, but at the same time that our goals are expanding, right? We want more clean as part of that. And so just because we built the right things for today doesn't mean that we built the right things for tomorrow. And so in the years to come, we need to go figure out what that path looks like. And while it's premature to know what it looks like today, that work is actively being done and will continue to be done going forward. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Ben. I just wanted to say that Ben just won an award in our office, and I think you'll agree with me that part of the reason why he won that award is because he is able to take very complicated concepts and let lawyers understand them. So Ben, thank you. It's really, really terrific, and another example of your unique ability to do that.
Thank you, and thank you all.
Thank you, Ben. Next up, we're going to have Tina, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the stakeholder process.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good morning, everybody. I guess it will still be morning for another 10 minutes. I'm Christina Ballou. I'm an Assistant Attorney General in the Energy and Environment Bureau, and I'm here today to talk to you about how stakeholders participate at ISO New England, who the players in the New England wholesale markets are, who's advocating for ratepayers and clean energy, and I want to give you some ideas about how you can participate if you'd like to be more involved. So what and who is the New England Power Pool? Until you heard Maura Healey mention NEPOOL this morning, some of you may never have heard of it, but it is an important player in the New England wholesale markets because it's the organization through which we advocate at ISO New England. So NEPOOL was founded in 1971 as a voluntary association. It was created to handle central dispatch of generation, settlements and billing, planning, and other measures to improve system reliability. In 1996, NEPOOL proposed the creation of ISO New England, and in 1997, ISO New England was created. So NEPOOL predates ISO New England by 25 years, and all those relationships predate ISO New England. And long ago, in a simpler time, NEPOOL originally performed some of the operational functions that ISO New England performs today. Although, as Meg's presentation pointed out, ISO New England's duties have greatly expanded since that time. Okay. NEPOOL after the creation of ISO New England. After NEPOOL transferred operational duties to ISO New England, NEPOOL became the primary advisory body to ISO New England, and its relationship with ISO New England is governed by the participants agreement. That is an 80-plus page document, and the relationship and the rules of engagement are highly formalized. One important provision of the participants agreement is that it requires ISO New England to vet market design proposals and rule changes through the NEPOOL process and to get a vote from the participants committee before filing anything at FERC. And this is a mandatory requirement unless there is an emergency or some type of exigent circumstance, which doesn't happen very often. I wanted to add that any other party who's making a proposal for a rule change or some alternative to a NEPOOL proposal also has to go through the NEPOOL process. So NEPOOL's mission is to ensure reliability, create and sustain competitive wholesale markets, and provide for an equitable allocation of costs, benefits, and responsibilities. And I will say that this very closely mirrors ISO New England's mission. So how is NEPOOL organized? This is a chart from the NEPOOL annual report, and it's a good visual representation of how things work. So new matters start over here. Can you all, I assume you all can see my cursor. New matters start over here at the technical committees that specialize in different subject matters. Sometimes new matters are at more than one committee if there is an overlap in subject matters. So assuming that a new proposal is successful, it then goes to the participants committee for a final vote. A helpful analogy about how NEPOOL works would be that it works like a legislature if that legislature met in a ballroom at the Doubletree Hotel in Westboro, Massachusetts. So it's not always grand, but we certainly do get things done. The NEPOOL process, in the NEPOOL process, proposals are made, they're debated, amendments are proposed, a vote is taken at the technical committee over here, and then it goes to the participants committee for the final vote. So who belongs to NEPOOL? Sorry, I didn't mean to jump back that way. Who belongs to NEPOOL? Let's talk about the 6 sectors at NEPOOL and who is in them. Generation is just what it sounds like. These are entities that own generating resources. The transmission sector is comprised, sorry about that. The transmission sector is comprised of transmission owners who own the long distance wires. These tend to be subsidiaries of distribution utilities that you would pay your bill to, so you would be familiar with these names. Suppliers, this is by far the largest group of stakeholders, and it's a very diverse group. They must be involved in power marketing, power brokering, or load aggregation to belong to the supplier sector. The publicly owned sector, New England has 59 publicly owned utilities. Those can be owned by towns or cooperatives, which are nonprofits owned by customer members. Alternative resources. This is where a lot of the clean energy technologies hang out. They have to be providers of renewable generation, distributed generation, demand response, or energy efficiency to belong to this sector. And then finally, we have the end user sector, and that's us. And end user is a fancy way of saying customers. Our sector is made up of commercial and industrial customers, ratepayer advocates, and public interest organizations with an environmental focus. So each of these 6 sectors has a 1/6 vote, that's 16.66%. And that raises an issue that I want you to be aware of, which is the difficulty of end users having say under this arrangement. So even though end users in New England number about 15 million, we get 16% of the vote, and we're limited to membership in just this one sector here, the end user sector. Compare this to the situation with generators of electricity who can choose to be in the generation section, the supplier section, or the alternative resources section, depending on their corporate setup and what their other corporate activities are. So they can spread themselves out over 3 sectors and potentially control those 3 sectors. Since a passing vote of 60 or 66% is needed, depending on the type of matter that's being voted on, for end users, building coalitions is crucial due to the way that the voting is set up. The importance of NEPOOL membership. The Attorney General's office has been a NEPOOL member since 2009, but before joining in 2009, we had been litigating at FERC for decades. But litigating at FERC has some drawbacks because it means you're challenging a fully formed market design or policy. The cake has been baked, so to speak, and you have to convince FERC that the end result is unjust and unreasonable. So what do we do at NEPOOL? At NEPOOL, the AGO advocates for an electric grid that is safe, reliable, clean, fair to all customers and technologies, and low cost to customers. So this is our mission at NEPOOL. And the benefits of NEPOOL membership, there are many. Being an NEPOOL member means having the opportunity to influence market designs from the ground up as they're being created, and that is very valuable indeed. It also means working very closely with all of the other players in the electric industry in New England and making contacts and building relationships with these folks. So exactly what do we do at NEPOOL? We attend and actively participate in all the technical committee meetings every month, as well as the participants committee meeting. We often attend 5 or 6 or more meetings, full-day meetings each month. It's a very significant commitment of time, and I'll show you that on the slide as we get further into the deck. We've had 2 Attorney General's Office personnel serve as vice chair of the end user sector over the years. I currently have that honor. We evaluate ISO New England proposed market designs and rule changes. And if we don't like them, we propose alternative market designs and amendments to the ISO New England proposals. And then we go about building our coalitions to try to get them passed. And finally, after something is finalized and gets a passing vote at the participants committee, we advocate at FERC either for or against, depending on where we were on this particular proposal. Here are some stats on our activities in 2020 at NEPOOL. So 69 days of committee meetings, that's more than 2 months, 275 principal committee votes, 251 legal proceedings that we participated in or actively monitored, and 512, that's the number of NEPOOL participants in total. So for our office, this works out to be a full-time job for 2 people. So I wanted to give you a few examples of successes that we've had through the NEPOOL ISO process, and there have been many over the years. For the sake of time, I'll just talk about 2 of these, the first one and the last one. The first one, ensuring transparency and accountability in transmission rates. There's an annual NEPOOL meeting where the transmission owners explain the inputs to their transmission rates. And in one of those meetings, we saw something that did not look right to us. It was a very significant amount of money. It wound up being about $9.9 million. And we asked what it was because we could not tell from the reports what it was. And they told us what it was, and we said, we don't think you can put that in the rates and make ratepayers pay for this. And they said, oh, yes, we can. So we had no choice but to sue them down at FERC, and we led a team, including other consumer advocates and AG's offices. Eventually, the transmission owner came to see the error of its ways, and we were able to negotiate a very favorable settlement in the form of a $6.8 million refund to New England ratepayers. But the matter did not end at the end of the case. We then used the NEPOOL process to ask the transmission owners if they would participate in discussions about how to improve this reporting of these rates and how to add transparency and dispute resolution mechanisms for the inputs to the regional transmission rates. To their great credit, they immediately said yes, and we embarked on over 2 years of discussions that resulted in a settlement that has improved reporting, dispute resolution provisions, and a great deal more transparency. And all of the companies are now reporting exactly the same way, which they did not do in the past either. So that settlement is currently pending before FERC, pending approval, and should be granted, I would think, sometime in the near future. The last bullet, facilitating entry of offshore wind storage in the forward capacity auction, it represents an example of a different kind of NEPL advocacy and cooperation. Early in the month, we were able to support a successful advocacy by an environmental group who's also a member of the end user sector. They brought 4 amendments forward that would make it easier for offshore wind, solar, and storage to enter the forward capacity auctions. And our office, specifically Ben Griffiths, was able to perform modeling of the behavior of storage resources that gave this organization the data it needed to support its storage amendment. And we also advocated at NEPL in favor of all 4 of these amendments with the various other sectors. The amendments received passing votes over ISO New England's objections and will soon be filed at FERC as an alternative to ISO New England's proposal. So we'll see what happens, but we have our fingers crossed. Barriers to participation. There are barriers to participation at NEPL for you as concerned individuals and to the public in general. And I don't think there's any point in sugarcoating or minimizing them. So we wanted to tell you what a few of them are. The first and most obvious is complexity. The complexity of the subject matter can't really be overstated. The tariff, which governs ISO's New England's actions in its relationship with its customers and other stakeholders, is 2,500 pages long, and it's written in what I can only charitably describe as a mixture of technicalese and legalese. It's very hard to understand sometimes. The learning curve is quite steep, and there are a lot of specialized economic and engineering issues. Many times I have wished I paid more attention to economics class in college. So those are some of the issues that you deal with on a regular basis at NEPL meetings. Time and expense, I've already alluded to the amount of time involved, and the expense consists of membership fees, which vary depending on what type of organization you are or whether you're an individual. And then there are expenses incurred traveling to and from the meetings and attending the meetings, which are typically held in hotels around the Boston area. Most NEPL meetings are not open to the public, so if you wanted to go take a look and see what was going on and see if you thought you liked it, you would not really be able to do that. So you have to join in order to attend the meetings. And until recently, no press was allowed at the meetings to tell everybody else what was going on there. About 3 years ago, an industry publication did sue at FERC for access, and they did win. So now we do have press at the meetings, and they do come out with articles of interest on what's been going on at ISO New England on a regular basis, and I'll identify a couple of those for you toward the end of the presentation. So a final wrinkle and barrier is that FERC has final say on market design issues. Once we've had a final vote on a market design, either ISO New England, NEPL, or both file it for approval with FERC. And FERC work is quite specialized, both substantively and procedurally, and many or most who participate do so through a lawyer. You can represent yourself, but it may put you at a big disadvantage. So there are barriers of time, cost, and specialized knowledge that many individuals are not going to be able to surmount. And those are some of the main reasons why we exist to represent your interests. So in addition to the Attorney General's office, the states also advocate for your interests at NEPL. And by states, I mean the New England governors and their designees. The states are not members of NEPL, but they're active in the NEPL process. If you remember that NEPL chart I showed you of the different sectors and the members, the states aren't on there. They have the status of permanent guests at NEPL, and through the New England States Committee on Electricity, or NESCO, that some of you may have heard of, they advocate for the New England state's collective interests, including clean energy laws and keeping ratepayer costs under control. So they are a critical part of the story, even though they're not members of NEPL. And like any other stakeholder at NEPOOL, the states have the power to propose amendments and alternatives and engage fully in the process. It's just that they couldn't vote on their own proposals, and so they have only the power of advocacy to to push their ideas and their proposals forward. Recently, the New England states have been re-examining their relationship with ISO New England, and they are publicly calling for changes. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about that. So there are two major initiatives that I wanted to talk to you about: the New England State's vision statement and the future grid process that Ben also mentioned. So the states have said they want changes to ISO New England's practices and to its governance. And they put those forth in the NESCO October 2020 vision statement, which you can find at nesco.com. And I recommend you take a look at it because it's interesting reading. The states have identified 3 areas of ISO practices where they believe improvement is necessary. One is the wholesale markets. They feel the existing market structure is not compatible with certain state laws and mandates regarding resource adequacy and clean energy, and they want a commitment to pursue a new regionally based market framework. Second, NESCO recommends that ISO New England conduct a comprehensive long-term regional transmission planning process that provides a transmission plan to meet the needs of states' energy transition, and they want input into that plan. And third, in the area of governance, the states pointed out that the ISO New England's mission and governance structures are 25 years old and need to be updated soon. So the specific complaint of the states with respect to governance is that, quote, ISO New England's governance does not give a sufficiently meaningful voice to state and consumer interests, and its mission does not reflect the relationship between ISO New England's functions and the New England state's legal requirements, policy imperatives, and associated consumer interests. And that is in the vision statement. They could not have been more direct about their dissatisfaction. And I would say that this level of directness is something new, and I think it's something good. The vision statement is interesting reading. It's not too long, so I recommend you take a look at it. And also in the vision statement, the states announced plans to hold public online technical conferences to discuss and receive feedback on the vision statement. They haven't announced yet when those will occur. Once we find out that information, we will post it on our website as well. So this is a second initiative that we're currently going through, and I think Ben mentioned it briefly. And this is something that NEPOOL, ISO New England, and the states through NESCO are working on right now, and have been working on since the beginning of 2020. It's 2 things. We are discussing a study of what the needs of the future New England electric grid will be when it has large amounts of clean energy generation, and that's this future grid reliability study, and a discussion of what future market designs could best accommodate those needs. So that's the pathways to the future grid. And that process is ongoing right now. The study has not commenced. We're just getting to the point where we're deciding what the study will be. And I think that process could easily take another year to conclude. So stay tuned for conclusions on that. All right, so what is the good news about everything that I've told you so far? Despite the fact that the subject matter is difficult and the process does not lend itself to public participation, you do have government representatives advocating for you, and that's the Attorney General's office, individually and in coordination with other New England ratepayer advocates in AG's office. We often band together on issues that concern us all. And NESCO is advocating for you. And finally, there are other Massachusetts agencies that are also advocating for you. Matt Nelson, who's the chair of the DPU, is a NESCO manager for Massachusetts, and Patrick Woodcock, the commissioner of the Department of Energy Resources, is also a NESCO manager. So both agencies fall under the auspices of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and they are active with NESCO. The EEA, as we call it, is, I think, going to be the one organizing and putting on these online tech conferences for the public. So stay tuned for news on that. The other good news is, I hope that it's been clear, it is possible for consumers to make a difference in ISO New England's policies and processes. You know, as I've mentioned, end users get things done and they have successes at both NEPOOL and FERC. And the changes may be incremental. Sometimes they seem very slow, but progress has been made. And the New England State's recent push in the vision statement is adding momentum. So what can you do if you would like to do more? I think the first thing is keep learning, be informed, and educate others. There are many resources out there. I gave you 3 links here. The ISO New England website has been mentioned by a few other presenters, and it really has a tremendous amount of information and a very good search engine, and also their phone app if you want to see, you know, up to the minute by minute market operations is a wonderful thing to have. NESCO has a website that talks about all of its initiatives and what the New England states are doing. And finally, NEPOOL also has a website that has just been redone and is going to be rolled out in the next week or 2. Finally, there are commercial publications like Utility Dive and RTO Insider. RTO Insider is the publication that's sued at FERC to get access to our meetings. I don't think, well, speaking for our office, we thought that was a good thing to have press access, and there have been no problems that I'm aware of about that. So I think that's been very beneficial. And typically these publications write about highly technical issues in a non-technical, easily accessible style. So I think you would enjoy reading those if this is something you're interested in learning more about. Okay, what can you do? You can advocate, you can work with the AGO and your government representatives and ensure that we have the information you think is necessary for informed decision making, and you can help educate and express your views to your legislators as well. Some more things you can do. You can participate. Participate in the upcoming online conferences that will be hosted by the states and will be open to the public to discuss the vision statement. You can also attend the quarterly ISO New England Consumer Liaison Group meetings. I gave you the link there. It's on the ISO New England website. So those meetings meet 4 times a year. They're free, they're open to the public, and they're geared towards a general public who may not be an energy professional. Our own Rebecca Tepper is the chair, so you will be welcomed and made to feel comfortable. The meetings typically consist of an update from ISO on recent developments of the last 3 months, a panel on a current topic of interest, and then questions and discussions afterwards. It's a way to meet other like-minded people who have your same interests and to get up to speed on some of the issues that ISO New England and NEPOOL are grappling with right now. Finally, what can I do? You can join. You can join NEPOOL as an end user if you're an individual. It's the cheapest. It's the cheapest admission. That it's $500 annual fee to join as an individual end user. If you do that, I'll be there to welcome you warmly and show you the ropes. You can join a public interest organization that is a NEPOOL end user. If you go to the NEPL website and you sort the members by sector and you look at the end user sector, you will see a number of well-known public interest organizations who have an environmental focus, and they are quite active at NEPL. And so if you join them, you will be having others advocating for you as well, and you will get news and updates from yet another source. And finally, you can join a local group that's active in the clean energy sphere, and there are an awful lot of them, an awful lot of good ones. You're probably already aware of some of them, but do your homework and decide, you know, who is a mover and a shaker, and whether their interests align with yours. So, conclusions and takeaways. What I hope that you'll take away from my talk today is that the AGO and the states are working for Massachusetts ratepayers and Massachusetts clean energy policies at NEPL and at FERC, and that progress on integrating clean energy into wholesale markets is gradual and will require new market designs, but the process is speeding up and progress is being made. And there are a number of ways you can educate yourselves and get involved, and we hope that you do. And so finally, I wanted to give you an example of change that's happening gradually, but inevitably. ISO New England now seems to share the view that the markets are going to have to change to accommodate clean energy. And this is not something that was a sure thing even a couple of years ago. So as an example of this, recently, without any fanfare, they changed their slogan to reliable electricity, competitive prices, and clean energy transition. And the clean energy transition part is the new part, and it's very welcome. So with that, I will leave you, and thank you for your time, and I look forward to the questions.
Hi. Well, Tina's very, very modest, and so she wouldn't say it herself, but she is now the head of the end user group, and that means that she sits on the executive committee at NEPL, and it's a real testament to her work there that her colleagues voted her to be the leader of that group, and we're very lucky to have her as part of our team.
Thank you.
Let's move on to a few questions. So if all the panelists maybe could come back online, that would be helpful. Okay, that's great. You all did a really good job. I think it was really informative, and I enjoyed listening to it. So thank you for all your work on this, and I think a lot of people really took a lot away from it. So let's get to people's questions. One of the questions that came up quite a bit was questions about transmission and how transmission relates to the markets and what ISO New England does with respect to transmission and how that all fits together. So Megan, you want to talk about that?
Sure, I'm happy to give some brief comments on that. I mean, we could have spent a whole webinar just talking about transmission because it's such a big issue, but maybe I'll say, you know, just a couple quick things. First, you know, transmission is really important to the market functioning well because it connects all the generators to that electricity superhighway that cuts across the region. And without the transmission system, the ISO can't dispatch the cheapest available resource. And there's congestion on the grid, as Ben was talking about. And we, you know, can't have new resources coming online and displacing older and dirtier generators unless we have this robust transmission system that connects everybody. So it's really important. But we also can't go around building a lot of transmission willy-nilly because it's very capital intensive, and these projects are big infrastructure projects that have, you know, real impact. So they can take a long time to site and build. So planning is really, really important. And the ISO plays a key role in that planning. They do long-term planning that forecasts transmission needs to ensure the system stays reliable. They evaluate the impact of new transmission projects that are proposed to connect to the grid. And for certain types of projects, they do a review to determine how costs are allocated. But the states play a really important role too. So, for here in Massachusetts, if a new transmission project is proposed, we have this state entity called the Energy Facility Siting Board that reviews the environmental impacts and the cost impacts of that project. And that review is really intensive. It can take upwards of a year even for the Energy Facility Siting Board to conclude its review. And these projects can also require a lot of other state and federal permits that they might need to cross waterways or go through forests, or for a variety of other impacts that they might have as big infrastructure projects. And I think it's really important to note that the ISO doesn't have any control over those state siting and permitting processes. This is something that is also happening in parallel. And I'll just note there's recently been a push to encourage more comprehensive regional planning of transmission, acknowledging all the transmission that we'll need to meet the states in our region's clean energy goals. And that NESCO vision statement by the New England states that Tina mentioned earlier had some recommendations in that regard. So sort of encourage planning, thinking about these clean energy goals, and encouraging more stakeholder involvement to ensure that we have all the transmission that we need to connect all of the projects that we need. As Tim described, there's really a need to ramp up clean energy generation massively, and there's going to be a lot of new transmission that's needed to connect all those new projects to the places where consumers consume the electricity.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've really advocated for, and us and many other people, is to have real competition on who builds transmission, because there's so much transmission that's going to be built, and there's lots of money to be made in building it. And it used to be a monopoly of just the transmission owners, the sort of your utility, who paid for that. And now we are trying to encourage, and FERC has encouraged that process to be more open to other people to build and to own. So hopefully you'll be seeing more of that. Thank you, Megan. People also were very interested in, they hear a lot about people talking about renewables being a variable resource, like they can't be online all the time. And people were wondering sort of what kind of policies or technologies are in place to support a large amount of that kind of resource as we're planning for the future. Anybody want to take that one?
Sure.
Thanks, Ben.
And maybe bucket into two different buckets. The first one is market reforms. The second one is the technologies themselves. So I think there's sort of everybody agrees that it's not always windy, it's not always sunny. And if you want to rely heavily on those technologies, you're going to need something to smooth it out. And a lot of people today I think are really interested in things like energy storage, probably things like batteries. And so there's sort of two issues there. The first one is, so that's still a relatively nascent discipline, certainly at the scale that we're talking about. You need a whole lot of phone batteries to make the equivalent of, one city worth of electricity. And so we need to find ways to go expand that, and especially make that longer duration. So be able to ride out for a day or 2 days or 3 days of consumption for those bad winter weeks when it's quite cloudy and not very windy for a sustained period. And we might also, in the very long run, need to start looking at sort of other kinds of technologies other than just the batteries. I think that a lot of people are thinking about. So that might be more hydro, that might be, even more speculatively, things like using hydrogen or some sort of carbon neutral hydrocarbon to use existing technologies to fill out around the gaps. So those are on the sort of technology side. On the market side, I think the biggest problem is how do you value storage? And that's a difficult thing because in some ways storage has sort of no intrinsic value. And what I mean by that is the value of storage is, or it comes through its ability to do something cheaper. In this case, it'd be like moving clean energy from a really windy period to a period where there isn't any. And so because of that, it doesn't it can certainly get paid through the energy and ancillary services markets, which is where it makes most of its money today. But for you, we're going to need to find ways to either extend those opportunities in the capacity market, or just find ways to value that time shifting nature of storage. And I think that there are a few ideas on the table, but I think that's sort of a $64,000 question.
Well, I think we have maybe just time for one more question. I want to be respectful of people's time. So while Ben's talking, I've been thinking about which is the one that people wanted to hear from about the most. And I think it would be about solar. And how does sort of, if I have solar on my roof, how does that interact with the wholesale markets? And is there any relationship there between what's happening in our town or happening, on our schools with what's happening at the wholesale level at ISO and FERC? Megan, do you want to do that one?
Sure. So yeah, there's a few ways that that distributed solar interacts with the markets, and I just want to note that the majority of the solar in our region is small distributed projects, and solar has been growing rapidly because we have a lot of great state and federal policies encouraging new solar projects. So one way it intersects with the market is that solar helps reduce grid demand, which can lower prices, because when there's less demand, as Ben was talking about, as demand increases, the ISO dispatches more expensive resources. So at the times when there's a lot of solar production, which is, on a warm day, can be really also coincident with times when there's otherwise a lot of peak demand on the system, like people firing up their appliances and using their air conditioning. It means that solar production can help reduce some of those peaks and help reduce prices. And solar can also play in the wholesale markets too. So for instance, we have entities that aggregate or bundle a bunch of solar projects together into kind of a virtual power plant that can bid into the forward capacity market that Ben talked about. So solar is a really important and increasingly growing player in the marketplace.
Thank you. Well, I think that is about all the time we have. I did want to say before we go that we will put up the presentations on our website. So if you want to find some of the websites that are cited in the presentations, we'll put those up. And otherwise, I just want to thank everybody for joining us. We're happy to see so many people join us. I saw a lot of new names that I haven't seen before, so great that we are talking to some different people. And we hope to continue to work with you all in the future. So thank you very much.